What's up, everybody? I hope you're having a great week. It's that funky week in between Christmas and New Year's. We don't even know what day of the week it is, and we're all full of cheese. All right, I hope you had a great Christmas. Today, we are going back to our roots as a church. If you're an old-timer at Essential, this home behind me may look familiar to you. This is where we started Essential Church. Back in 2015, we had our first interest meetings here. We had our launch team meetings here, and we started with 21 adults. And it's incredible these years later what God has done. God has been so good and so faithful to us. And so it's good just to go back and revisit some of our history. And the sermon you're about to watch is a part of our history as well. This is the sermon when we officially launched our church back in February of 2016. And it's about being full of grace and full of truth. And I love that we use this last Sunday of the year to really just, stay true to what God started us off as. And so we're going to look at this John chapter 1 about Jesus being full of grace and truth. And because Jesus was like that, you and I are supposed to be full of grace and truth as well. So enjoy the first official sermon we ever had as a church. What's up, neighbor? If you were here last week, you will recall that I met a really amazing young lady in college. Anybody remember the story? Anybody here last week? That amazing young lady was just up here. And you will also recall, if you were here last week, if you weren't here last week, don't worry, I'm about to fill you in. We were good friends, and I wanted to become more than good friends. So I asked her on a date. And if you'll recall, I remember two things from that moment. I remember her laughing, and I remember her saying no. And then I asked her a second time, and she said no. And I asked her a third time, and she said no. I can only take no's so many times. I was like, how many times can I realistically ask this young lady to become more than friends before I just can't take no's any longer? So last week, I mentioned she turned me down 3 times, but then I also mentioned, hey, now we're together, now we're married. So today I want to tell you a little bit about what happened in that gap. After the third rejection, I started thinking, listen, I've got to get creative here. I can only take rejection so many more times. So I recall that Kristen was working part-time for a friend of mine. The friend of mine was a youth minister at the church that I went to. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to go to this guy. I'm going to let him know. Listen, I want to be more than friends. So one Sunday, I go to this guy. And I say, listen, Kristen, she works for you. I'm friends with her, but I want to be more than friends. Can you give me any advice? Can you give me some insider information on how I can win her heart? I will never forget. He looked me in the eyes and he said, Tim, Kristen will go on to date and eventually marry someone who is tall, dark, and handsome. You are none of those things. I'm not making a non-exaggeration. Non-exaggeration. He said all those things. He said it with a straight face. And I was like Robert, I already know that. Give me something I can work with. And he said, listen, if you really want to pursue Kristen, listen, you're not going to get any taller. Looking at your skin complexion, you're not going to get any darker. You're not all that handsome, but let's start there. And you know what? He gave me, seriously, this all happened, and he gave me some advice. And from that advice, I realized that I kind of let myself go. I ended up gaining a bunch of weight in college. I never got a haircut. I was one of those guys that was always cutting my hair by myself at home. And so, I actually went to Supercuts and got a real haircut. I actually started, anybody here, you always dress yourself in the dark? You know what I mean? You dress yourself in the dark, and then when you come out into the light, you're like, well, that didn't really match all that well. Oh, well. You know what I mean? That was me. That still is. That was me, in college. And so I started dressing a little nicer. I actually went and got my car washed. I cleaned out the inside because I knew that I had to present myself as a little more attractive. Because something had to happen, or I was going to get that 4th no, and that 5th no, and that 6th no, and eventually she would just stop talking to me. But what I want to highlight is what my friend did for me. He gave me truth and grace. If he would have just given me truth, if he would have just said, listen, man, you're not tall, dark, and handsome, you got no chance, forget about it, it would have crushed me. It would have crushed me. It would have certainly hurt our relationship. And honestly, if he would have just given me grace, if he would have just been like, you know what, 4th time's a charm, my friend. Go ask her one more time. You know what, that would have eventually crushed me as well. But he didn't do that. He gave me truth and grace. And if we're being honest this morning, if you know yourself, anybody here, you just admit, like, I tend to lean towards truth. Anybody here, like, you know what, when it comes to truth and grace, you're a truther. Anybody here, and like, you would just lean towards grace. You're like, you know what, I avoid the conflict. It's just easier for me to say, hey, just try it a fourth time. Just go for it. You're fine. You're tall. You're dark. You're handsome. Just go for it. But listen to this. A pastor in the Atlanta area, Andy Stanley, many of us, or some of us may be familiar with him. I love what he says about this. He's addressing this very issue. And listen to this. And this is a paraphrase. But he says, listen, the goal is not to find that perfect balance between grace and truth. Right? And like many times we think about that. It's like, I just want to be just the right amount of grace. I want to be just the right amount of truth. That's not the goal. The goal is to be perfectly graceful and perfectly truthful. I don't know what you gave up to be here this morning, but I think it was worth your time. Today, we're going to be talking about a passage, and I honestly believe this. I believe that if we got this passage, like if we understood it, and we applied it to our lives, we would see this city transformed. I really do believe that. I believe we would see this country transformed. I believe we would see this world transformed if we truly understood the passage that we're about to read, and we applied it to our lives. Last week, we launched the church. We had our first weekly service, and in honor of that, we started a new series called Launch. And each week, we are taking a discipline of following Christ, and we're going to ask ourselves, how can we launch that within our own lives? All right, so last week we talked about faith, and many times when we're talking about spiritual disciplines, many times the thing we think about are things like a prayer, like reading God's Word, maybe fasting, some of these other things that many people who follow Jesus, they do on a regular basis. But this morning, I want to submit to you that we should all pursue making a lifestyle of grace and truth a daily discipline as well. Not just grace, not just truth, not some balance between those two things, but making a daily lifestyle of being full of truth and grace. So we're going to jump right into the scripture today. If you need a Bible, raise your hand. We've got volunteers passing out the Bibles. Volunteers, come on to the front. If you need a Bible, raise your hand. We are going to be in John chapter 1, verses 9 through 14. If you need a Bible, this is a free gift from us to you. You can take this home. We're able to do this because of the generosity of people who come and make this church their own. So please take this home, a free gift from us to you. We got someone up here in the front row. Michael up here, we've got somebody up here who needs a Bible. We'll also have the words on the screen. And if you're here and like church is a new thing for you, or you're just checking it out, or maybe you stopped going a long time ago, maybe you've never been exposed to church. If you're new here, this is a great week for you to be here. I think when we get into this message this morning and we get into the Bible, I think you're going to agree that even if you do not see eye to eye with Christians, those who follow Jesus, I think you're going to agree that if Christians really did get this text and they really did apply it to their lives, like those would be the kind of Christians you would want to be your neighbor. The Christians who understand this text and apply it to their life, these are the kind of Christians you'd want to work with. These are the kind of Christians you'd want your kids to go to school with. So if you're here, you don't believe, you're just checking it out, maybe somebody invited you and you just wanted to be kind and that's why you're here, this is a great week to be here because I think we can both agree that you want to be surrounded by people who get this. So let's jump right in. John chapter 1, verses 9 through 14. It says, "The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born, not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father." Get this, "full of grace and truth." I want to be sure we all walk away with one thing. I know we do this every week, but I want to be sure we all walk away with one thing. Like, so that when you're having lunch today and somebody says, "Boy, what did we talk about?" You remember one thing, let it be this. The main point, we launch grace and truth in our lives by receiving, by imitating, and by giving. We can launch grace and truth in our life by receiving Jesus as our only hope, by imitating God, and by giving grace and truth to others. So I'm going to say it one more time, and I want you to repeat it after me. I just want to be sure we're all involved on this. We launch grace and truth in our life by, say it with me, by receiving, by imitating, and by giving. All right, let's jump right into the first one. Look at verse 10. We launch grace and truth by receiving Jesus as our only hope. Verse 10, he was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Anybody in the room today, who was Jesus' own? Say it out loud, louder. The Jewish people. The Jewish people were Jesus' own. They were the religious people. Now get this, many times we read over this. Like if you grew up in church, like if you read your Bible on a regular basis, maybe you've read that very same passage and you say that Jesus' own did not receive him. Have you ever connected the dots on this? The Jewish people, they believed the Bible. They didn't have the New Testament, right? The New Testament's about Jesus and his teachings and afterwards. They didn't have the New Testament, but they had the Old Testament. Like the Old Testament, that's like 2/3 of the Bible. His own had that. They applied it to their lives. The Jewish people believed in the 10 Commandments. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about these people, they read the same Bible you have. Of course, we have the parts about Jesus now. But back then, they read that, but they still didn't receive him. Why? Why didn't they receive him? There's probably a bunch of reasons. But get this. The main reason they did not receive Jesus was because after they saw Jesus, they realized they wanted something different. Put this on the screen. Jesus' own weren't looking for truth and grace. They weren't looking for truth and grace. They were looking for a political king and national power, but what they got was a servant leader who taught that the greatest thing to do is to love God and love others. And when they realized that that's what Jesus was, they rejected him. They rejected him. The Jewish people weren't the only people who rejected Jesus. It said the world rejected Jesus. Everyone else also rejected Jesus. In fact, in this passage, if we'd start a little earlier than verse 9, we'd see that everything was created through Jesus. But the creation rejected the Creator. Everyone rejected Jesus, his own and the rest of us. We all rejected Jesus. Jesus came teaching what they needed to hear, but they wanted something different, and they killed Jesus for it. They killed Jesus for it. And killing Jesus is not always far-fetched. I know many times we'll read the text and we'll think, man, how in the world could they have tried them and crucified them? How in the world could they have done that? But honestly, what I'm about to say, I know it's sensitive, I know it's hard to hear, but there is a part of me that honestly believes that if Jesus, if he was born, if today, if the manger scene happened today, if the whole wise men scene happened now, I honestly think there's a possibility that we might have killed him again. Why? Put it on the screen. Many times we walk like this. We say, if I just received fill in the blank, then I'd be happy. Then I'd be secure. Then I'd be complete. But what happens if Jesus says, no, I have something different? How do you receive that? How do you receive that? How many of us, if we're being honest, if we just said, you know what? If I just had perfect health, then I'd be happy. Then I'd be complete. Then I'd be secure. But what if Jesus says, no, I've got a different path for you right now? How many of us, if we said, you know what? If I just become pregnant, then I'd be happy. Then I'd be complete. And what if Jesus says, no, not right now? How do we receive that? What if we say, if I were just married, if God would just give me that husband or that wife, then I'd be happy. And what if Jesus says, no, I have a different plan for you right now? What about some of us, we say, you know what, if I just got that promotion, if I just got that raise, if I just got that job, if my kids would just call me, if my parents would just call me, if my spouse would just like me, if my kids would just behave, then I'd be happy. Then I'd be complete. And what happens when Jesus says, that's not the plan I have for you? Killing Jesus, I'll be honest, is not always far-fetched. when we do not get something we want, or when we get something we do not want, how do you receive it? How do you receive that? Listen to this. Jesus is bringing truth and grace. Jesus brought reconciliation with God. But honestly, most of us, that's not what we were looking for. We want something more like health or wealth. You know what I'm saying? Like we wanted something different than what Jesus is offering. And maybe you'll get those things, but maybe you won't. How do you receive Jesus? And you might be saying here, you're like, listen, all I want to do is be healed. But what if Jesus says, I have a different plan for you? God's ways are so much bigger and they do not always make sense to us. Sometimes God has a different path than the path we would have chosen. Let me share a story with you. It's actually of my dad. He's actually in the room today. Let me share a story of my dad. A few years ago, he had to get a hip replacement. He's way too young even now to have a hip replacement. But a few years ago, he was way, way too young to have to get a hip replacement. It was painful. It was a long journey. It was an expensive journey. It is not a path he would have chosen. No way. No way would he have chosen that path to have to go through that. But you know, God had a different plan. And God used that. My dad ended up having to slow down a little bit because of the hip replacement. Obviously, there was a long recovery. He had to rest afterwards. He had to slow down. And because he had to slow down, it actually forced him to kind of change his normal routine. Because his normal routine slowed down, he ended up having some very interesting conversations with people within our family. Maybe some of you are even in the room today. Lives were changed because of those conversations. Dare I even be so bold to say, an entire family tree had been transformed because of that hip replacement surgery. Would Dad ever want to go down that path? No. Would he have ever chosen to go down that path? Absolutely not. But God had a different plan, and he used it. Now, all right, now let's talk to the rest of us. Some of us were like, yeah, honestly, yeah, I didn't get what I received. But some of you, you're here, and you're like, no, what's the problem? Like, I like Jesus. Like, what's all this talk about killing God? Like, that's not me. I love God. I love going to church. I love obeying the rules. Like, that's not a problem for me. Like, I like being a good person. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you a tough question. Will being a good person save you? Don't answer that, because if you answer wrong, I'm about to go into it. Okay. Will being a good person save you? We obey Jesus, right? Like we live like to love others and to love God, not so that God will love us. We do those things because God already has loved us. And when we see how broken we are and yet how loved we are, like our hearts begin to melt. And we can't help but to love God and love others. But if we don't get it right, we can fall into a trap of doing the right thing, of doing good things, of being good people, not because we've been loved, but so that we will be loved by God. And that's a completely wrong way of seeing it. We can fall into the trap. Even those of us who love coming to church, we can fall into the trap of doing good things so that God will owe us. What's your favorite soft drink? Yell it out. What's your favorite soft drink? Come on. Oh, okay. I only heard the first, and I only heard the last, but that's the way it is in the gym. So, Mountain Dew and Coke. Show the picture. How about that? A Pepsi machine and a Coke machine for our two people. All right. I was talking about this passage with Lee. Lee, one of the pastors on staff here. And he's like, oh man, you guys share this illustration. Like, this is the way I think about this. Let's say you went up to a soda machine and you put your money in it. Right? You put your change in it, or now, like you put your credit card, boy, times are changing, and you put your money into that thing, and you hit the Mountain Dew button. What do you expect to come out? A Mountain Dew. But what happens when a Coke comes out? Or speaking from experience, if you're a Mountain Dew fan, your least favorite is going to be Diet Pepsi. What happens when a Diet Pepsi comes out? What do? Let's be honest. I know what most of you do. Yeah, we all, it's just, it's inherent what you do. You grab the thing and you shake. You shake. You know what I mean? Like, you start kicking, like you pick up bricks, you start throwing, I'm just, all right, no, you don't throw bricks. You get frustrated. We do the same thing with God all the time. We do the same with God all the time. God, I asked for a Mountain Dew. You gave me a Diet Pepsi. And you start getting frustrated. You asked for good health, but you don't have the good health yet, and you get frustrated. You asked for a job, but you don't have the health yet, and you get frustrated. But you're like, but God, I put the change in. I've been working really hard to please you. I've been doing my best at being a good person, but I didn't get what I asked for, and you get frustrated. Listen to this. If you are living a good life so that God will owe you, you will have a perpetual, low-grade anger forever. Why? Because you're not getting what you want. You will always be frustrated when the God that you think you're serving so that he'll owe you does something different. We have to watch ourselves. Even those of us who've fallen in love with Jesus, we can still fall into this trap of just doing right things so that God will owe us. It's like you're putting coins in that vending machine so that the day that you do want a Mountain Dew, you're going to get it. We must guard ourselves against this. All right, so we don't receive God by being good, and we don't receive God by being bad, and we don't receive him by being default. Read with me verse 12. But to all who did receive him, that's Jesus, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. To all who received him, he became the right to become children of God. What does culture tell us? What does culture tell us about this? And this is a tough thing to say. Like, that's why I got like this metal thing right here so I can hide behind it if anybody gets offended. Culture tells us that we are all children of God. Culture tells us that we are all children of God. But guys, there's no way we can be intellectually honest with this passage that we just read and believe that. Read it again, verse 12. It doesn't say everyone. It says, but to all who received Jesus, he gave the right to become children of God. Listen, has God created all of us? Yes, absolutely. So in one sense, like, are we all children of God? In the sense that he created us, yes. But we must place our faith in Jesus to become children of God. Put this on the screen. You can only become a child of God on the basis of what Jesus has done for you. Not your good works. Only on the basis of what he's done for you. Because it came for you. And you become a child of God by believing in Jesus. We must receive him. You may be talking, why in the world are we talking so much about receiving Jesus when we're talking about launching grace and truth? Because the fact of the situation is, you cannot move forward in living a daily discipline of grace and truth until you receive Jesus. You can't move forward. It doesn't end with receiving Jesus, but you can't move forward until you receive him. So let's go to the second point. And don't worry, the first point was the longest. Second point, we launch grace and truth by imitating God. Put the Bible verse, Ephesians 5, 1 and 2. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children. Walk in love, as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. I love it. Imitate him. Imitate him. But if somebody says imitate God, do we know how to do that? How do we imitate him, right? Somebody says, hey, go imitate God. How do we do it? Let me ask you a question. I want you to yell it out. What was the most important event in your life? What was the most important event in your life? I see like half of you touching your spouse right now. That means like, you're like, all right, say, like, tell me something. Yell it out. 1, 2, 3. What was the most important event?
It's my daughter's birth.
All right, daughter's birth. I'll kind of like, thank you for the 3 of you who participated. Okay, all right, yes. Important things, but listen to this. What does verse 14 say of the passage we just read? It said the Word, that's Jesus, became flesh and dwelt among us. If this is true, and I believe it is, this is the most important thing that has ever happened in humanity, in history. And so if you're a skeptic here today, do you understand the claim that's being made? The claim that is being made is that Jesus stepping into humanity is the single most important thing that has ever happened to humanity. And if you're a skeptic today and you're curious, this is where you need to start your investigation. This is quite a claim. All right. Jesus came and we saw how he lived. That's the first step in imitating him. That's the first step in imitating him. Chuck Swindoll, some of you may know him from a while back, a pastor and author. And he overheard a man sharing a story. And the story goes something like this, a true story. There was a winter storm. And there's a man, it wasn't Chuck Swindoll, it was another man, and he was sitting at home. And it was terrible conditions outside. And he heard a little thud. And he heard it was coming from the kitchen. So he walked over to the kitchen, and he saw that these little birds, little sparrows, were flying into the kitchen window because it was so cold outside. They were trying to escape the storm by coming into the warmth of the home. And every few seconds, he'd hear another thud, another bird hitting the window. Well, the man, he had a barn not very far. And so he said, you know what, let me put my coat, let me put my boots on, let me go up there, open the barn door so those birds can survive the storm in there. Everything he tried to get those birds into that barn failed. At first, he just tried to go around the birds and kind of corral them into the, and the birds would move, but they kept perching back onto that branch trying to fly into the house. It didn't work. And then the man, he took some breadcrumbs. He made a little path from the limb to the barn. The birds would have none of it. Then he started throwing the breadcrumbs at the birds, trying to get them to chase the bread. I mean, he was trying everything. He tried everything he could think of. And then eventually he gave up. He tried everything. And so he came back inside, and he took off his coat, took off his boots, and he just resumed his day, watching TV, reading, whatever. But he kept hearing that thud. And it just tore him up. And the man was recounting the story to Chuck Swindoll, and he said this. He said, I could not think of anything to do. I wish I could become a bird so that I could talk to those birds and lead them to the barn. It would be that simple. And of course, Chuck Swindoll, as a pastor, immediately saw how that it connected with exactly what Jesus did for us. He became one of us. And now we can imitate him. Of course, Jesus coming so we can imitate him, that's just where it begins. He went on to do a whole lot more than that. He died to pay for sin, but now we can imitate him. He became flesh. He dwelt among us. Now we can imitate him. Now we can imitate his grace and truth. So what is grace? What is truth? What is grace? Grace, let's use this working definition. It's the free, unmerited favor of God. Grace is the free, unmerited favor of God. What is truth? What is truth? That which is in accordance with reality. Two working definitions. We could probably spend all day thinking through what is grace and truth, but let's work with those definitions. All right, first, how was Jesus able to bring grace? Look at verse 29. Well, put the first part on the screen. There we go. So we stopped at verse 14, but if we kept going a little further, we would see a verse that we actually read together a few weeks ago. It says this, John the Baptist introduces Jesus as, behold, the Lamb of God. John the Baptist knew Jesus was coming to die for us. John the Baptist knew that. Jesus came to die to free us. I love this. I don't love this first part. Let me say the first part. Where there's a sin, a price must be paid. When we disobey God, when we go our own route, a price must be paid for that. And this is the part I love. I've got a friend, John Stone. He said this once. He said, Jesus paid for your sin. And in God's court, there is no double jeopardy. Once the sin has been paid for, it does not have to be paid for again. All those broken things we've done, all those broken things we're going to do, they've been paid for. And if you place your faith in Jesus, a second payment is not necessary. There is no double jeopardy in God's court. Jesus does not have to die a second time for your sin. You do not have to die for your sin. Why? Put it on the screen. Because Jesus paid once and for all the sins of those who believe in him. That is why he can be graceful. That's why Jesus can bring grace. And honestly, that's why you can be graceful as well. And the second one, how can Jesus bring truth? Listen to this. Truth, because he designed us. If we would have began in verse 1 of John chapter 1, we would see that Jesus designed us. He knows our reality. He knows how we tick, how we operate. That's how Jesus can speak truth. Why does Jesus say don't have an affair? Why? Because Jesus knows us. He designed us. He knows having an affair, it's not good for you. It's not good for your spouse. It's not good for the other people. It's not good for the children involved. It's not good for the community. How can Jesus say don't lie, don't steal, don't block justice? Because he knows our reality. He knows those things are not good for us. They're not for our good. That's how he can say it. Listen to this. The commandments that Jesus gave us to love God and to love others, it's not to restrict our life. It's to enable us to have life. That's how Jesus can bring truth and grace. And as we receive Jesus, as we imitate him, we will realize that grace and truth is a gift we can give to others. Verse 14, check this out. We have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. For those of us in the room who follow Jesus, I submit to you, give the gift of grace and truth to others. And when you realize that God has given you grace and truth, you will not be able to help but to give grace and truth to others as well. Let's take a stab at this. Feel free to yell out the answer. What happens when we are all grace or all truth? Anybody want to venture an answer? What happens if we're all grace or just all truth? It doesn't work. I like that. It doesn't work. It creates problems. And my guess is every single person in this room struggles with something on grace and something on truth. Usually depending on what issue we're talking about. Listen to this. If you zoned out, zone back in. This is important. Many times we can do exactly what the Pharisees did. Pharisees, they were Jesus' own. They were the religious elite within the religious community. The Pharisees would do things like this. They would put these really high standards on sins that they didn't struggle with. And then a Pharisee puts a really low standard on something they do struggle with. And then when they see somebody struggling with something they don't struggle with, they look at you like you're crazy. What's wrong with you for struggling with that? Anybody here ever seen that happen before? But in Scripture, we say, listen, all sin, it's not down here, it's not way up there. It all separates us from God. And when we understand that, it radically changes the way we see things. If you struggle with being judgmental, understanding grace and truth, understanding that all sin separates us from God, it's going to wreck that part of you, the judgmental part of you. Grace and truth is so attractive. And the greatest coaches, the greatest mentors, they get this. You drop the ball. Well, let's work. Let's be truthful about it. Let's figure out how we can prevent from dropping the ball again, but I'm not going to drop you. You made an F on a test. Students in the room, you made an F on a test. Well, let's be honest. Let's work. Let's see how we can not make an F again. But you're not a failure. You screwed up. Let's figure out how to make it right. But you're not a screw-up. You see how grace and truth radically changes everything. And here's the beauty of Jesus. No matter what happens, you can always fall back on the fact that Jesus came for you. He died for you. He is your only hope. And he's crazy in love with you. No matter what you do, no matter how far you fall, you can always find rest in that. And honestly, everything else is secondary. That's right. So how do we apply this passage? As we come to an end this morning, how do we apply this passage? All right, listen to this. In your program, there's a little blue card. Let's see if I got mine. In your program, there's a little blue card. I want you to take a look at this. If you didn't get one on the way in, be sure you grab one on the way out. This says, who have you just shown grace to? Who have you just shown truth to? And we've all done it. In fact, you're probably not going to have to think too hard on this. Let me give you a little hint if you're having a hard time coming up with something. If you live with them, You've probably just shown them grace or just truth at some point. And who can you go and make it right to? And you can say, you know what, man? I just showed you grace, but I need to show you grace and truth. Or I just showed you truth, I need to show you grace too. Let me give you a few examples. Jesus himself gave the finest example. He gave a bunch of examples. John chapter 7, the woman caught in the act of adultery. It's a great example. They were about to stone her, right? They were about to kill her. That was the punishment for that crime at that time. And Jesus showed her grace, perfect grace. But then what was Jesus' last words to that woman? Anybody remember? Yeah, go and sin no more. There was grace and there was truth. For you, who knows what your story is? Maybe, if we're just being honest, like maybe the person's even in a room, and I'm not trying to step on toes, but I'm just trying to give an example of grace and truth. Maybe your friends, and honestly, that person, they are an alcoholic. They're an alcoholic. It's a problem. It's ruining relationships. And up until this point, you've been doing a great job at showing them grace, right? Maybe that person, they got kicked out of their house, and you're letting them stay in your spare bedroom or on your couch. You're doing an amazing job showing them grace. But is grace all that person needs? No, they need some truth as well. What if this week you approach them and you're like, listen, let's sit down and talk when they're sober, and you say, listen, I've been showing you grace. You're more than welcome to stay on this couch as long as you need to, but let's talk about a little bit of truth. What about that guy at the office or that kid at school? We all know somebody the way I'm about to describe. We all know somebody. And there's something about them that nobody else in the office can stand. But nobody has the guts to go and tell them. Does everybody know the person I'm talking about? Like, there's something about that person. Nobody can stand them. And it's a complete blind spot to him. We all know people like that. Or maybe it's a neighbor. Maybe it's a classmate. What if you were the person who loved that person so much that you could give them one of the greatest gifts you've ever given them? And if you don't know how to do that, let me tell you how I start those conversations off with. In fact, like a few of you are going to be like, Tim, you've said this to me. I've said this to a lot of people, actually. And a lot of people said it to me, some version of it. I may be way off on what I'm about to say. Like, this is what I'm telling the person sitting across from me. I may be way off on what I'm about to say. And you might just want to jump over this table and punch me. And it might be fair, and I might be wrong. But have you ever thought about fill in the blank? Amazing things happen when I have those conversations. And honestly, the way I started this morning, where my friend told me the grace and truth story, listen, you're not tall, you're not dark, you're not handsome, those things is the greatest gift we can receive, and it's one of the greatest gifts we can give. Who have you only shown grace to? This week, go and make it right. Write it on this thing. And who have we only shown truth to? And guys, let's be honest. We gave a bunch of examples where we're only showing grace. Let's just be honest. Usually, we're only showing truth. Sometimes we use truth like a sledgehammer, and a lot of people get hurt. And sometimes we need to go back and show a little grace as well. And not a little grace. We need perfectly graceful, perfectly truthful. Who here do you need to go make that right with? Write it down. Tape it somewhere where you're going to see it until you go and you make it right. The truth is, we need more grace and we need more truth. Grace can be hard to give and truth can be hard to receive. But we need that. We need that. And if all of us, if we made it a daily discipline to live with truth and grace, we would see the city transformed. We would see this nation transformed. We would see this country, of course this nation and this country, and this world transformed. Let's launch grace and truth by receiving, by imitating, and by giving.